My name is Amelia Carter, and I'm 29 years old now. But the story I'm about to tell didn't begin with success or companies or money. It began with something much quieter, something that took years to understand. It began with a little girl who slowly realized she was invisible inside her own family. I grew up in a small house on Elmwood Drive in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Nothing fancy, just a narrow 2-story place with creaky wooden stairs and a backyard that flooded every spring when the snow melted. Most of my childhood memories involve my mom, not my dad. My father, Richard Carter, worked at an insurance company downtown. At least, that's what he always said whenever Mom asked why he wasn't home again. Meetings, clients, deadlines. There was always something more important than being there. When I was little, I kept expecting that one day he'd finally slow down, that maybe he'd show up to one of my school events or sit with me at the kitchen table while I did homework. But those moments never came. Mom was the one who handled everything. When I won my first science fair in 5th grade, she was the one in the front row clapping so loudly that people turned around to stare. When I ended up in the emergency room with food poisoning from the school cafeteria, she was the one rushing me to Mercy Medical Center at midnight. Dad? He was stuck in a meeting he couldn't leave. That was the phrase he used a lot. At the time, I believed him. Kids tend to believe their parents. Things started changing when I was 5 years old. That's when my younger sister Isabella was born. And suddenly, it was like someone flipped a switch in my father. The man who barely had time to eat dinner with us became a completely different person. He was suddenly present, hands-on, excited. When Isabella got older and started joining activities, Dad became her biggest fan. Dance recitals, soccer games, Girl Scout cookie drives. He never missed a single one. I still remember sitting on the metal bleachers during one of her soccer matches when I was around 12. Dad was standing on the sidelines shouting encouragement. That's my girl, Bella. When the game ended, he lifted her into the air and spun her around like she just won the Olympics. Then he took her to Dairy Queen for ice cream. The 3 of us drove home afterward. They talked the entire time. I sat in the back seat watching the streetlights pass by. Nobody asked how my day had been. Now, to be fair, I never blamed Isabella. She didn't ask for any of it. She was just a kid who loved attention and had the kind of bright, outgoing personality that made people gravitate toward her. Dad adored that. He used to say she reminded him of himself. Meanwhile, I was different, quiet, curious, more comfortable with books and computers than with crowds. When I was around 11, we got our first home computer, a bulky gateway desktop that hummed loudly every time it turned on. While Isabella spent afternoons at dance practice or volleyball training, I spent mine in my bedroom learning HTML and experimenting with simple websites. The internet felt like a universe waiting to be explored. Every time I figured out how to make something work, a button, a layout, a small script, I felt this spark of excitement, like discovering a language only a few people understood. But whenever Dad walked past my room and saw me sitting in front of the screen, he'd pause in the doorway. Then he'd sigh, not loudly, just enough that I'd notice. I could almost hear what he was thinking. Why couldn't I have another daughter like Isabella? He never said those words out loud, but sometimes silence says more than any sentence ever could. Mom noticed it too. She tried to balance things out. On weekends, we'd go to the Cedar Rapids Public Library, where I'd spend hours wandering between the technology and science sections. Sometimes we baked chocolate chip cookies together. Other times, we worked on puzzles at the kitchen table, while music played softly in the background. Those were the moments I held on to. One night when I was 13, she looked at me across the kitchen counter and said something that stuck with me for years. You don't have to be like your father to be extraordinary, Amelia. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but I needed to hear it, because more and more, it felt like my father saw me as a disappointment, simply because I wasn't a copy of him. As I got older, I stopped trying to win his attention. I had tried before. Once I even asked if he wanted to see a small program I'd written. He stared at the screen for about 10 seconds. Then he said, "That's nice," and walked away. After that, I stopped asking. If he wanted a relationship, he'd have to try too. Spoiler alert, he never did. Meanwhile, Isabella kept thriving in the world Dad loved. Cheerleading, student council, school events. They'd spend entire Saturdays together, shopping at Jordan Creek Town Center, riding roller coasters at Adventureland in Altoona, grabbing burgers at Zombie Burger in Des Moines. They'd come home laughing, talking about their day like they were best friends. And me? I'd usually be in my room reading a Stephen King novel or coding some small project. That was our family dynamic. Two people living one life, and one person quietly building another. Then everything changed. When I was 14 years old, my mom died. It was a snowstorm on Interstate 380. A drunk driver ran a red light downtown. She had just finished grocery shopping at Hy-Vee. The police officer who came to our door looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. I remember Isabella crying. I remember Dad hugging her tightly. What I remember most, though, is the strange silence that followed. Because after my mom was gone, the one person who truly saw me disappeared too. And that's when I started realizing something terrifying. In my own house, I was completely alone. After my mom died, something in our house shifted in a way that was hard to describe. It wasn't loud. There were no dramatic arguments or doors slamming. If anything, everything became quieter. But it was the kind of quiet that presses on your chest until it's hard to breathe. For a few weeks after the funeral, people came by constantly. Neighbors from Elmwood Drive, Mom's co-workers, church, everyone kept saying the same things. She was such a wonderful woman. We're so sorry for your loss. You'll get through this together. But the truth was, we didn't get through it together. Not, if anything, the distance that had always existed between my father and me suddenly became a canyon. And somehow, the grief only made him cling to Isabella even more. They cried together, leaned on each other in a way that completely excluded me. At least, that's what I told myself for years. But intention doesn't really matter when the result is the same. I became invisible. One afternoon, about 3 months after the accident, I came home from Jefferson High School feeling completely drained. The entire day had been unbearable. Teachers looked at me with soft voices and careful expressions, like I might shatter if someone spoke too loudly. Students whispered in the hallways. Some gave me those pitying smiles that somehow made everything worse. All I wanted was to go home and feel normal again, to sit at the kitchen table, maybe talk to Dad, maybe pretend for a few minutes that life hadn't completely fallen apart. But when I walked through the front door, I heard laughter coming from the living room. Dad and Isabella were on the couch, watching a comedy special on Netflix. They were laughing so hard, Isabella nearly spilled her soda. For a moment, I just stood there in the doorway, still wearing my backpack, waiting for them to notice me. They didn't. Eventually, I walked past them toward the kitchen. Dad glanced up briefly. "Oh, hey, Amelia." Then he turned back to the television. That was it. That tiny moment shouldn't have mattered, but for some reason, it did, because something inside me cracked a little that day. I realized that even after losing the person who held our family together, nothing about their world had really changed, but mine had collapsed completely. After that, I started spending almost all my time in my room. Not because I wanted to, because it hurt too much to be anywhere else. Dinner conversations revolved around Isabella, her dance competitions, her volleyball practices, plans for a father-daughter weekend trip to Chicago. Sometimes I'd sit quietly at the kitchen table while they talked across from me like I wasn't even there. If I tried to join the conversation, Dad would give me this strange look, like I'd interrupted something important. Eventually, I stopped trying. I learned how to exist without being noticed. And that's when coding stopped being just a hobby. It became an escape. Every afternoon, I'd sit at that old gateway computer and lose myself in lines of code. Python, JavaScript, basic database design. At first, I was just following online tutorials, but soon I started experimenting with my own ideas. Simple websites, small tools, programs that solved tiny problems nobody else cared about. Every time something worked, I felt this small rush of satisfaction. It was a world where effort actually mattered, where results were clear, where no one dismissed you just for being different. Dad didn't see it that way. To him, the computer was just another sign that something was wrong with me. One evening, he stopped outside my bedroom door and watched me coding for a few seconds. "When are you going to do something useful with your time?" he asked. I didn't turn around. I am doing something useful. He scoffed. You sit in front of that screen all day. That's not a real skill, Amelia. I kept typing. He added one more comment before walking away. Real women don't hide behind computers. I remember staring at the monitor long after he left. Not because his words surprised me, but because by that point, I expected them. Still, something interesting started happening over the next couple of years. The more time I spent coding, the better I got. By junior year, I was building websites for small local businesses in Cedar Rapids. Nothing huge. A dentist's office, a small clothing boutique, a landscaping company. They paid me small amounts, sometimes a couple $100s, sometimes just gift cards. But it felt incredible. For the first time in my life, someone valued something I created. By senior year of high school, my skills had improved dramatically. I even entered the Iowa State programming competition. Dad didn't come. Isabella had a volleyball tournament that same weekend. But when I won first place, something inside me finally clicked. I realized that this wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was my future. Computer science, software engineering, building things people actually needed. I started researching colleges obsessively. Some nights I stayed up until 3 a.m. reading about different tech programs. Eventually, I made a list of schools that had the strongest computer science departments. And I didn't aim small. MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon. Even if I didn't get accepted, I wanted to try. When the acceptance letters started arriving, I remember sitting on my bedroom floor surrounded by envelopes. My hands were shaking because for the first time in my life, a door was opening, a real one. But there was one problem I couldn't ignore. College was expensive. Even with scholarships, I would still need help paying tuition. And like it or not, the only person who could realistically help was my father. So one evening, I gathered everything: acceptance letters, scholarship offers, my coding portfolio. I laid them neatly across the kitchen table. Dad was sitting there drinking coffee while scrolling through something on his phone. Can we talk? I asked. He barely looked up. About what? I took a deep breath. About my future. What happened next would become one of the most important conversations of my life. And it would also be the moment I realized something painful. Sometimes the people who are supposed to believe in you the most are the first ones to give up on you. The acceptance letters were spread across the kitchen table like pieces of proof. Proof that everything I had been working toward for years was real. MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon. Even Iowa State University had offered me a strong scholarship package for computer science. I stood there looking at the envelopes for a moment before Dad finally glanced up from his phone. He frowned slightly. What's all this? My heart was beating so fast I could feel it in my throat. These are my college acceptances, I said. That got his attention. He leaned forward and picked up one of the letters, scanning it quickly. He muttered. Then he set it down like it was just another piece of junk mail. So what exactly do you want from me? The bluntness of the question caught me off guard. I had spent weeks rehearsing this conversation in my head. All the ways I would explain my plans. How I'd show him I was serious. How I'd finally make him see that what I was doing mattered. I need help paying for tuition, I said quietly. I quickly started explaining the numbers. I already have scholarships, I said, sliding one of the documents toward him. But even with those, there's still a gap. If I combine financial aid and work study, it's manageable. I just need some support to get started. Dad listened for maybe 30 seconds before leaning back in his chair. He sighed the way he always did when he thought I was being unrealistic. Amelia, he said, rubbing his temples, I don't think it's worth spending all that money on something so uncertain. I blinked. Uncertain? Technology changes every year, he said. It's unstable. You'd be better off choosing something practical. Practical. The word made my stomach twist. I already have an internship lined up in Des Moines this summer, I said quickly, at a startup. They're building inventory software for retail companies. This field is growing fast. Dad shrugged. That's still a gamble. I stared at him, trying to understand how the man who had spent thousands on Isabella's dance camps and sports tournaments suddenly cared about financial caution. He had paid $3,000 for a summer dance program in Colorado without blinking. But now my education was too expensive. I'm not asking you to fund everything, I said carefully. Just help me get started. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he picked up one of the acceptance letters again and studied it like he was looking for a reason to reject it. Finally, he set it down. There's another issue, he said. I felt something tighten in my chest. What issue? He folded his arms. Isabella's been having trouble with her grades. I waited. And? I asked. For a moment, I thought I'd misunderstood him. What does that have to do with my tuition? Dad's tone became slightly impatient. Family resources are limited. The words landed like a punch. I felt heat rise in my face. You've spent thousands on her activities for years, I said slowly. But helping me go to college is suddenly too much? It's not the same thing, he replied. How? He sighed again. Amelia, you've always been the smart one. You'll figure things out on your own. I stared at him because he wasn't refusing because he couldn't help. He was refusing because he had already decided where his support belonged. And it wasn't with me. You're choosing her, I said quietly. That's not what I said. But his expression hardened. Watch your tone. Something inside me finally snapped. For once, I said, my voice shaking, I'm asking you to believe in something I care about. He didn't even hesitate. I think silence filled the kitchen. I realized then that no matter what I said, nothing, not the awards, not the acceptance letters, not the years I had spent building something out of nothing. He had already decided who deserved the investment. I slowly gathered the papers from the table. Dad didn't try to stop me. As I turned toward the hallway, he added one last comment. You'll understand when you're older. I didn't answer, because in that moment, I understood perfectly. That night, I packed a single suitcase. Clothes. My laptop. A few books. I moved quietly through the house while Dad and Isabella watched television downstairs. Neither of them noticed. The only time I paused was when I passed my mom's old photograph hanging in the hallway. For a second, I stood there looking at her smiling face. I'm trying, I whispered. Then I walked out the front door. I drove 20 minutes to Marion, Iowa, to my Aunt Claire's house. She was my mom's older sister. We weren't extremely close, but she had always been kind to me. When she opened the door and saw the suitcase, she didn't ask a single question. She just pulled me into a hug. And suddenly, all the emotions I'd been holding back for years spilled out. I told her everything. The tuition conversation, the favoritism, all the years of feeling invisible. She listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. Well, she said calmly, then I guess you'll just have to prove him wrong. I laughed weakly. That requires college tuition. She thought for a moment. Then she said something that completely stunned me. I'll help you. I blinked. Aunt Claire, you don't have that kind of money. She worked as a nurse at St. Luke's Hospital. Her salary barely covered her own bills, but she waved off my concern. We'll figure something out. Over the next few weeks, something incredible happened. Aunt Claire talked to her friends, coworkers, neighbors, people who barely knew me, and somehow they all chipped in. Small amounts, $50, $100. Sometimes more. It wasn't enough for a full ride, but it was enough to get me started at Iowa State University. I remember sitting in her tiny kitchen, looking at the stack of checks on the table. People who weren't even related to me believed in my future more than my own father did. And right then, I made a promise to myself. Every dollar they gave me would matter. I would work harder than anyone expected. And one day, I would build something so successful that no one could ever dismiss me again. What I didn't realize yet was just how dramatically my life was about to change. Moving into my Aunt Claire's house in Marion wasn't glamorous. Her place was small, a modest 2-bedroom ranch with outdated wallpaper and a kitchen so narrow that if 2 people tried to pass each other at the same time, someone had to step back. But to me, it felt like freedom. For the first time in years, I lived somewhere I didn't feel like an unwanted guest. Aunt Claire never treated me like a burden. If anything, she acted like she had been expecting me all along. You focus on school, she told me the night before I left for college. The rest will sort itself out. Those words stayed with me because when I arrived at Iowa State University, I knew exactly what I had to do. I had no safety net. No wealthy parent funding my education. No backup plan. If I failed, it wouldn't just be my own dream collapsing. It would mean every person who had believed in me had wasted their faith. So I worked. Harder than I had ever worked before. Computer science wasn't easy, even for someone who loved coding as much as I did. The classes were intense. Algorithms, data structures, database architecture, operating systems. Some nights I barely slept, moving between lectures, labs, and the campus computer center where I worked part-time. But unlike high school, this environment was different. Here, being obsessed with technology wasn't strange. It was normal. Professors actually encouraged curiosity. Classmates debated programming concepts like they were discussing sports scores. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. During my second year, something interesting happened. One of my professors, Dr. Raymond Cole, stopped me after class. "Amelia," he said, adjusting his glasses, "have you ever considered building software for small businesses?" I frowned slightly. "What kind of software?" "Inventory systems," he replied. "Customer tracking, order management." He explained how many small retailers were still relying on outdated spreadsheets or handwritten logs. "Someone with your skill set could solve real problems," he said. The idea stuck with me. That night, sitting in the computer lab at 2 a.m, I started sketching out a concept, a mobile application that allowed small businesses to track inventory, manage suppliers, and monitor customer purchases in one streamlined system. It was ambitious, probably too ambitious, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Over the next 2 years, the project slowly took shape. Between classes and my campus job, I poured every spare moment into development. There were nights when the only sound in the computer lab was the soft tapping of my keyboard and the hum of fluorescent lights. Sometimes frustration hit hard. Code that refused to work. Features that broke unexpectedly. Entire weeks where progress felt non-existent. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered the stack of checks on Aunt Claire's kitchen table. The people who believed in me, so I kept going. By senior year, I finally had something real, a working prototype. The first version of the app could track product inventory, alert owners when stock was running low, and generate simple sales reports. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. I decided to test it with a few local shops in Ames. The results surprised me. They loved it. One store owner told me it saved him hours every week. Another said it helped reduce inventory errors almost immediately. For the first time, I realized this project might actually become something bigger than a college experiment. After graduation, I made the decision that scared me the most. Instead of applying for corporate jobs like many of my classmates, I went all in on my app. Starting a company from scratch was terrifying. I had almost no connections in the tech industry, no investors, just a laptop, a tiny apartment in Des Moines, and a piece of software I hoped people would need. The first year was brutal. There were months when I barely made enough to cover rent. I worked insane hours, coding updates, pitching to businesses, handling customer support. Sometimes I wondered if my father had been right. Maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe I had chased something unrealistic. But then things slowly started changing. One retailer recommended my software to another. That business told 2 more. Word spread. Soon I had dozens of small businesses using the system, then hundreds. 2 years after launching the company, something incredible happened. A regional manager from Target contacted me. They wanted to test my inventory system for smaller store locations. I nearly fell out of my chair reading the email. If this worked, everything would change. The pilot program was successful. Soon after, contracts followed. Then Walmart expressed interest. And suddenly, the little startup I had built alone in my apartment was growing faster than I ever imagined. By the time I turned 25, my life looked completely different. I had an office downtown overlooking the Des Moines River, a team of developers working with me. Tech magazines started writing articles about my company. One headline called me Iowa's quiet tech innovator. The money started coming in too. At first, I used it to pay off my student loans. Then I helped Aunt Claire pay down her mortgage. Buying her that freedom felt better than any award I had ever received. But success brought something else with it. Something I didn't expect. Loneliness. Because despite everything I had accomplished, there was still a part of me that wondered if my family even knew or cared. Years passed without a single call from my father. Not one message. Not even a short congratulations when my company started appearing in the news. I told myself it didn't matter. And most days, it didn't. My life was full. My work was exciting. And somewhere during those hectic startup years, I met someone who made things even better. His name was Daniel Brooks. He was an engineer working with a logistics company that became one of my early clients. We met during a software integration meeting. Unlike most people in business meetings, Daniel didn't try to impress anyone. He just listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions. Afterward, he caught up with me in the hallway. "That system you built," he said, "is actually pretty brilliant." I laughed. "Pretty brilliant?" He grinned. "I'm an engineer. That's high praise." We started talking more after that. Coffee meetings turned into dinners. Dinners turned into long conversations that stretched past midnight. Daniel didn't care about my success or the articles written about my company. He just liked me, the real me. And for the first time since my mom died, I felt like someone truly saw me again. Life finally felt stable, balanced, almost peaceful. Then, 3 years ago, everything changed again. One evening, I was working late in my office when the security desk called upstairs. "Ms. Carter," the guard said, "you have visitors in the lobby." I frowned. "I don't have any meetings scheduled." They said they're family. My stomach dropped because I already knew who it was. And when I stepped into the lobby, I saw them standing there, my father and Isabella. After nearly a decade of silence, they had finally come back. For a moment, none of us moved. The glass doors of the lobby reflected the city lights behind me, and I could see my own expression staring back. Calm, controlled, almost detached. But inside, something old and familiar stirred. Memories. Years of silence. Questions I had stopped asking a long time ago. My father looked older than I remembered. His hair had gone almost completely gray, and the confident posture he used to carry had softened into something more tired. Isabella stood beside him, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. She looked nervous, uncertain, and strangely small in the massive marble lobby of the building. They were dressed simply. Worn jackets, faded jeans. Next to the sleek suits and polished shoes of the people walking through the building, they looked out of place. I walked toward them slowly. "Amelia," my father said. Hearing my name and his voice after all those years felt strange, like listening to a recording from another lifetime. "Hi, Dad." The word came out automatically, not warm, not cold, just factual. Isabella gave a weak smile. "You look successful." I glanced down at my tailored blazer and then back at them. "I've been busy." An awkward silence settled between us. Finally, I gestured toward the elevators. "Come upstairs." If they were going to say whatever they came here to say, I preferred doing it somewhere private. The ride to the 20th floor was quiet. Neither of them spoke. When the elevator doors opened, I led them into the conference room overlooking the Des Moines River. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled the room with city lights. My company's awards lined the wall behind the long mahogany table. They sat down slowly, looking around like tourists in a museum. Dad cleared his throat. "We heard about your success," he said. I leaned back in my chair. "Oh?" "Articles," Isabella added quickly. "People talk about you." "Interesting," I said, because no one had talked to me. Dad folded his hands together. "We figured it was time we stopped by." I waited. Years of business meetings had taught me the power of silence. Eventually, people say what they actually came to say. Isabella broke first. "Look," she said quickly, "we need your help." There it was. Straight to the point. "What kind of help?" I asked calmly. She hesitated. Then the stories started pouring out. Apparently, life hadn't gone the way the golden child had expected. Isabella had dropped out of college after her second year. Something about losing motivation. After that, she bounced between jobs, retail, waitressing, short-term office work. Somewhere along the way, she started relying heavily on credit cards. The debt piled up quickly. $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. Eventually, she couldn't keep up with the payments. Now she was facing eviction from her apartment. Dad had been helping her financially for years. But his insurance business had declined. Clients left. Income dropped. And now they were out of options. So we thought, Isabella finished quietly, maybe you could help us out. I sat there for a moment, absorbing everything. It felt surreal. The same people who had ignored my existence for nearly a decade were now sitting across from me asking for money. Finally, I spoke. You're asking me to bail you out. Dad leaned forward quickly. Not bail us out, he said. Just help family. Family. The word echoed in my mind. I stood up slowly and walked to the window. The city lights stretched across the river below. 10 years ago, I had left my father's house with one suitcase and a laptop. Now I owned the building behind me. And suddenly I realized something strange. I didn't feel angry, just clear. You know what's interesting? I said quietly. Neither of them answered. I turned back toward the table. When I asked for help paying for college, I continued, you told me to figure it out myself. Dad shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't like that. Really? I looked directly at him. You said Isabella needed the family's support more than I did. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I continued. I was 18 years old. I had acceptance letters from some of the best universities in the country. The room felt very still, and you chose not to support me. Isabella stared at the table. Dad rubbed his forehead. We made mistakes, he said quietly. I nodded. Yes, you did. Silence stretched between us again. Finally, Isabella spoke, her voice shaky. I know things weren't fair growing up, she said, but we're still family. I looked at her carefully. She wasn't wrong. But family wasn't just a word you used when you needed something. It was something you built with actions. And theirs had spoken very clearly. I worked incredibly hard to get here, I said. That's obvious, Dad muttered. I built this company without any help from either of you. Another silence. Then I said the sentence that had been waiting inside me for years. I don't owe you anything. Dad looked like someone had slapped him. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. I thought maybe things could be different now, she whispered. They are different, I replied. I walked to the door and opened it. The hallway outside was quiet. This conversation is over. Dad stood slowly. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue. Then something in my expression must have convinced him not to. They walked past me toward the elevator. Just before the doors closed, Dad turned back. You're really not going to help us? I shook my head. No. The elevator doors slid shut. I returned to my office window and watched as they left the building. Their old Honda Civic pulled away from the curb and disappeared into traffic. And strangely enough, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel bitter. I just felt peaceful. For years, I had believed I needed my father's approval, that somehow proving myself to him would fill the empty space left behind by childhood. But standing there in my office, overlooking the city I helped build, I finally understood something. His approval had never been necessary because the people who truly mattered had already believed in me. My mother, my Aunt Claire, the strangers who helped fund my education, and the person who now stood quietly behind me. Daniel wrapped his arms gently around my shoulders. You okay? He asked softly. I nodded. I think so. He kissed my temple. You did the right thing. Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. But one thing was certain. I had built my life on my own terms. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't hurting the people who doubted you. It's simply living a life so successful they finally realize what they lost.